Hey everybody, welcome to the Faith Church Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Williams. Joining me today is Jeff Clossy.
Hey Jay, good morning, man.
How's it going?
Hey, it's going well. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Had a big weekend. And
yeah, it was a big weekend.
Yeah.
How does it feel to have a graduate?
I don't know. It feels like Tuesday right now. I think it'll hit more later when we send him off to college. But for right now, it feels like the end of a school year, you know, and especially in our line of work, we go to a lot of graduation parties every year. So the fact that we hosted one is just a slight difference there, but
I know I'm watching because a little more attentively than I have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have a junior in my house this year.
Yeah.
And it's not that I haven't paid attention. I just now I can tell this is getting closer to home, this reality. So I'm watching you and others around us that are walking through this season. And I'm both excited and like, okay, this is going to be hard too. You know, it's both things.
It is both things. It really, I will say this, that it's, when you think about the importance of grieving and grieving well and allowing yourself to grieve, that's been helpful to me in this season, has just to not just gloss over that. Because sometimes what happens is you think like, oh, but I have so much to be thankful for. Yes, I do. I'm really thankful for so many things with where my son is and what he's doing. And I'm amazingly thankful. But I'm also sad that this season is coming to an end, and that's okay. I can grieve that. Like I'd made a slideshow for his graduation, and I didn't want to shut it off. It was like the very last thing that I did was disconnect the laptop because I couldn't. It's just sad to like think, oh, and you're seeing all the pictures, you know, when he's younger. And I did second guess myself. I had a sweet moment with him. I know he doesn't listen to the podcast, so this is fine. But I had a sweet moment with him where I said, you know, what's hard is everyone looks back at this time, I think, and wonders, did I use the time well? You know, did I do? And you're never gonna feel like you did enough, right? It's never gonna. But I definitely felt I was kind of second guessing things and wishing some things that I hadn't done that I wish we had done, wondering, did I instill certain things in him, whatever. And he told me, because he was going through all the pictures to choose, and he said, you know, I think anybody that looked at all these pictures would think you did a pretty good job.
That's
I was like,
that's a gift.
Yeah. I'm not crying, you're crying.
Yeah.
I was like, oh gosh, yeah. So I was thankful for that. But yeah, man, it was a wild weekend. And now we move forward. So there you go. And you, in 2 years, you will be in that same situation.
Definitely feeling that. It's I'm excited. I mean, people listening know that soccer season's up and going, and this is going to be these summers to me they're precious times to be with our kids, to be with family. And then the beautiful thing is you get to be with other people as you do it. Yeah. And I'm excited about all that. But yeah, knowing that we're kind of counting them down too feels a little, that's real.
It's real.
It is.
But don't grumble about it.
Why not?
Because we're not supposed to.
Oh yeah, I heard that. Yeah. Oh, wait, did you preach on that on Sunday?
I think so. If you weren't paying attention.
I was. I took a bunch of notes.
I bet you did. There's so many dumb jokes we could make about this. I think you were grumbling. Yeah, I have some things I want to dispute.
I have a page of grumbling, and then I have
Yeah. I'd like to take issue with some of these things. Let's jump in. I definitely took a bigger picture view of the passage. And so I thought it would be good at the podcast level to dig down, get into the weeds a little bit with it, and to talk specifically about grumbling and disputing and what are those and how do we know if we're doing that. I touched on it from a big picture point of view and talked about why it matters because it's countercultural, right? So the whole issue is Paul, kind of saying that, look, you, by being countercultural, he could have also said, do all things without being worldly, that you may be blameless and innocent, like that you be holy and separate. Like you are God's people, so you are meant to live as God's people, not as the world. And there are going to be a lot of ways that where those cultures clash. And so in those situations, it's really critical that when those cultures are at odds, that you are functioning as a part of the kingdom culture rather than the worldly culture. So that was kind of the big angle that I was talking about, but I realized I didn't really have time then to dig into a lot of examples of what are ways where the worldliness comes through and kind of infuses our culture in specifically with grumbling and disputing. And so I didn't know if you had any. I was hoping that I could ask you and you would have thoughts on that. Otherwise, it'll be a really short podcast.
Yeah, I mean, initially, so we were just looking actually before we got on the podcast at those two words as well. So the ESV that we read from on Sunday mornings uses grumbling or disputing. It looked like the NIV used grumbling or arguing just to kind of situate it. And I mean, at the outset, what strikes me is that this is something that is super important for every single one of us. Not just important for people out there, but for every single one of us, me included, to have in mind, because we live in a time where I think, I'm sure it's always been this way, but it feels to me like more than ever, to be a grumbler, to be someone who's argumentative can be sort of a badge of honor. It's not necessarily a mark that a person would have and it somehow, diminishes you as a person, right? Sometimes it's a way of showing intelligence, to be sort of, contrarian, I guess, to always find fault. And I think especially as we head into, we're in this, like everyone knows, we're in an election year again. I think there's going to be ample opportunity for us to live out this, what Paul is describing here, to live out, what does it look like to be lights in the midst of a time when grumbling and arguing and complaining are pretty normal. And there are ways that you can make a lot of money doing that well, right? I mean, it's fascinating how that can be very lucrative. The very thing that Paul's saying here, don't do this, can be something that brings a lot of fame. So, I mean, as far as examples,
well, let's touch on that really quick before we go into, because I think that's a key point, that it's not just that this is a part of our culture, but it's actually a valued part of our culture. That there is it's similar to gossip in the sense that there's a kindred spirit that we have with other people when we can grumble and complain and dispute about those people. And then just financial gain. I mean, it just money, power, influence, those are all found right now in how much you can grumble and dispute. Mm-hmm. If you try to start a news website that is actually balanced and actually like gives the benefit of the doubt and just wants to report on what's actually happening, you'd fail. Yeah. It wouldn't
get clicks.
It wouldn't get any
views.
clicks. And so the whole idea that our economy right now, more and more, especially in the media world, whether it's mainstream media or social media, it all ends up being the same, because the whole idea is I need to get clicks and I need to get views. And the way to do that is to accentuate differences and to attack and to grumble and complain about how the world is because of those people over there. It is so normalized that we don't even realize it. And I think when you think about how Paul calls that out and uses those as an example, and I'm thinking, man, anyone that questions the Bible's relevancy, look at passages like that. So there's nothing new under the sun, right? So people then were doing the same kind of thing. This is what, whether it's propaganda about the Roman government or, the way that Christians should interact and the way Jews and Gentiles should interact. I mean, there's always this idea that people who grumble and dispute are going to gain a certain currency in our culture. And Paul is warning them, don't do that. don't buy into it. And so what does that look like then to not buy into that? If that's so much about our culture, how do we make sure that we're not? And the first thing that I would want to point out, so maybe we can even think of it in these kinds of categories. One is we have to be mindful and aware that this is the reality. Because I think a lot of times we just don't even realize we're doing it because it's just the air we breathe.
Yeah, it's normal.
It's just normal.
It's normal. And I mean, it can feel good, right? And in the moment of doing it, like, it's an expression of, I don't like the way things are or the way that person is or what they believe, but it's also a way of expressing, and I'm so thankful that I'm not them. And there's something about us in our human nature that it can feel good to do it. You know, it strikes me that the Philippian people that Paul wrote this to had better reasons to complain than we do as well. Like that they were living under, I think it was Nero, wasn't it? I mean, I have to check that, but I feel like the Roman leader at the time would have been him, and it would not have been hospitable to their beliefs.
No, it's definitely turned at this point that they're not just a fringe group that people are just leaving alone. They're actually, this persecution is starting and increasing.
So I think that they would have had plenty of reason to do that, to be grumbling, to be argumentative, to nitpick. And clearly that one of their distinguishing marks was that they weren't going to be that way.
Right.
You know, and I think that requires a significant amount of trust that God is really running the world and that God really is in control and that he really does see what's happening and he's not indifferent to it. You know, I mean, it comes back over and over again to me to who am I trusting in and what do I think is going to make things okay? Right? And I to me, that's, at least in my heart, that's when things aren't going right and I am complaining, when I'm feeling like, hey, I just want to argue. That's what's going on. And I think it's important we can make a distinction between that as a pattern of life and living and acknowledge, like, it doesn't mean you don't have to acknowledge that things aren't okay when they're not.
Right.
Right. It's not like you just say, well, it doesn't really matter. And well, it does. We live in a world that's broken. So there needs to be a way in which you're able to express that in a way that's healthy and right. And then at some point, though, it does cross the line into, that went beyond just expressing that this is broken or this is difficult. Right?
Yeah, and I think one of the ways where it crosses the line is what is our posture in it, and what is our what are we trying to gain through that? So if we are grumbling and complaining and disputing and bickering as a way of, like, kind of securing our own identity or being seen as intelligent or, being seen as discerning because I can nitpick over here and find this one little word that I don't like or I don't like, all of that is revealing a posture that is not unified. It's the opposite. It's a posture of disagreement. It's the opposite of what Paul says in Romans, that as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with all. Live peaceably with all. The idea that your posture should be for peace. Your posture should be one that seeks to understand and seeks to find common ground. That's meant to be our posture. But I would say that often what's revealed is my posture is, I want to find something that I disagree with. I want to find a way to separate myself from them, whoever them is. It could be non-Christians in the world. It could be a different political party. It could be people in your own church where it's like, no, to be courageous and to stand for truth means that I can quickly point out how everybody doesn't have it exactly right, to whatever degree that is, which is the opposite of, if you think about the opposite of grumbling and disputing, it would be like encouraging and unifying. It would be seeking understanding. It would be having a posture of, man, even if you say something that I'm not sure I agree with, that I'm going to ask questions, and I want to first make sure that I understand what you actually mean by this and what you're actually saying, and then I'm going to work from there, right? And as opposed to starting with the posture of like, well, I don't like what you just said, and I know why you said it, and I disagree with you, and just being left there.
It's a lot easier, I think, at least with the way things are, to assume and to nitpick on the things you disagree with. It's a lot harder, I think, to say, you know what, I want to agree with you. Help me understand. Like, why do you think that? That's a lot harder. It really is. It takes effort because one of the reasons it can be harder is it can be threatening. What if we find out we're wrong? Right? I mean, to hear someone out is to put yourself in a position of humility and I think a little bit of vulnerability of saying, maybe my view, whatever it is, on whatever topic it is, needs to be reexamined. And that's really counter to the way of the world, right? Where it's self-justification and self-exaltation rather than a humble listening. Yeah, I think it strikes me, Jay, that the posture is going to be one of the most important parts that we think about if we want to know if we're doing it or not. Because I think getting really practical with it, that's the question. When am I doing it? When are we doing this?
Well, so let's talk about that posture really quickly. So I think one thing to consider is when I'm listening to somebody or I'm reading something, is my main aim to find things that I disagree with, or is my main aim to actually understand what the person is saying? And we fill in so many blanks. We just make so many assumptions about why people do what they do, think what they think, which is why we get caught into these things, these certain phrases and and these key words that are like, oh, if I hear that word, then this is what I know you really mean by that word. Like and that's all created in a divisive world that wants to kind of create these tribes, this tribalism, where now I'm going to attack the other side. I'm going to give you the warning, like, here are the words. If they use these words, this is what they actually mean, where that may not be the case. So just thinking, okay, what's my posture? Do I, and what's funny about this though, Jeff, and I don't know what you think about this, with how tribal we have become in so many ways, even within the church, that we tend to assume agreement with people that we see as in our tribe, even though we might actually have some real disagreements there, but we assume that we know what they mean, and they mean what I mean by this. And we assume disagreement with people who we don't label as a part of our tribe. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to deal with that. To the extent that would be, well, if you're a brother in Christ, I assume unity. And I want to hear you out on this because I assume. But I think that there's not even that, in the sense of, like, first of all, that's not the signifier of our tribalism. So it's not like we're just saying, well, if you're a brother in Christ, then I'm going to seek to understand you. And if you're not, then I'm going to assume that we're probably not going to have the same understanding of this, which that would be a pretty biblical worldview. But we have these other identifiers, whether they're political or social or whatever they are. And so we can actually look at a brother or sister in Christ, whether it's, like I said, political, theological, social, and say, well, no, you're not a part of me. Like, we're not in the same tribe. And so I just immediately look at things that I disagree with you about, rather than trying to understand why we might have a difference of opinion. I don't know. I'm processing that out of just realizing it's ironic that we say we have a posture in our culture of disunity and disagreement and looking for ways we can disagree. But that's not always the case. We're actually not very discerning at all with people that we see in our own tribe, right? They could say something that would be totally outlandish, and we would still like, oh, no, I'm sure I know what they mean. Like, they probably meant this. And so I don't know what it looks like to say, hey, within whatever group you see yourself as a part of, whoever you think you're most like-minded with, you should actually be really discerning there and make sure that you are on the same page on some big things. And then with people that are outside of whatever your camp is, you probably have more in common with them than you realize. And so you probably have less in common with the people in your camp than you realize. You probably have more in common with the people outside of your camp than you realize.
Yeah, you can't, those listening cannot see me nodding along with Jay here, but yeah, I agree. I mean, it seems to me that the very places that we probably think we need to be the most critical in a positive sense, like just aware and in trying to communicate well, are probably the places we're most susceptible. Like you're saying, out there, of course, out there, we're not going to necessarily see eye to eye. We already assume that. But I think it's important that you brought into the mix that it's not just in the realm of ideas or theology, it's also social, right? It can be just like choices about even hobbies, teams, whatever. I mean, they can be subtle things that we feel like, well, this person clearly thinks like I do because they listen to this music that I like, or they like this team that I like, or they hunt the way I hunt, or whatever the thing is. To me, it really does highlight the importance for each of us who's following Christ to be conscious of and building our identity upon Him, right? I mean, Him being our defining factor, not the other things that are changeable and malleable in our world, but Him. And if He is the foundation of who we are and what we are about, His kingdom, that transforms then, I think, even what we feel like the need to argue about. Right? Because there's, in any given day, I'm sure each one of us has things like words we could say that could be critical of a thing. But most of the time, I think for a lot of us, we just choose not to say it because it's like, well, I don't need to say that, right? I would do it differently, but I don't need to express that. And maybe that's just learning more and more when we feel that impulse. What do we do with it?
Yeah.
And I think I shared this early on in my development as a leader. One of my mentors gave me this example. Yeah, this was in a sermon I shared.
Yeah.
He said the phrase, "I don't have to have an opinion about that." And that has been a really freeing thing for me. And it has allowed me to listen to people who I think you're coming at this from a different angle than I would, without feeling like I need to, as I'm listening, formulate some sort of response, some sort of argumentative response. I can just take it in and learn. Even if in the end I'm like, I see it differently than you, it helps me to not be so critical of it. I think there's a difference. We experienced this when we got to Canada. So at first it was so fun because it was new, right? After a while, though, when you're living in a place that you are different from and not from the place, things that were novel at first can kind of start to be grating because they feel like this isn't how we do things. And that happened probably like 6 weeks into our time there. And I had gotten a text from someone who had served overseas in missions, so in a place that was much more different than the States. And he made this distinction that really helped me, and it might be helpful just practically with this grumbling and arguing. He said, you need to remember there's a difference between something being wrong and something being different. And I think that's really helpful. Sometimes there are things that are just wrong that we disagree on, right? One of us is right, one of us is wrong.
Right.
But in our world, a lot of times it isn't that way. It's just different. There's different ways of doing things. There's different ways of running things. And sometimes we're disagreeing on that level too. And we use a lot of energy disagreeing about things that are just different.
But I don't know if we have those categories anymore. Because I
like
think
culturally, you mean?
Yeah, because I think that we connect all the things that are different to something that is wrong. So if you serve ham sandwiches when I think you should have served turkey, that's somehow connected to some root thing of like you're supporting some agenda, or like you spent too much money or not enough money or whatever the case is. It's wild. Like I'm trying to think of things that are not quite that dumb, that are just that we just so quickly connect to motives and morality. We just try so quickly to get it to some kind of black and white thing. Like because you think that the school board should handle this issue this way means that you think X, Y, and Z, which that's wrong.
Yeah, there's a whole cascading.
Yeah.
And then there's a diminishing of that person really quickly.
Yeah.
In our head before we've even understood. Maybe they don't think that. Maybe that's not that way. Yeah, you're right. I think we're in an age where that's really difficult.
But do you even want? Like, that's the thing. That goes back to the posture. Do you want to be in agreement with somebody? Or have you already categorized them in such a way that you think, no, your holiness is actually going to be seen in how you disagree with them? And I think we got to be mindful of that's what the Pharisees did. Like, the Pharisees were the kings of nitpicking because their holiness was determined by the way they could make you look unholy. That's how they gained their holiness. And I think that's been a really critical issue in the church, that we get our holiness, our status of holiness, from making other people look unholy.
Yeah, it's like the virtue of disagreeing or being, that's and that does become then, I think when that happens, often what's happening is an identity is being built on that.
Right. Well, think about even among pastors, it's very common if a book comes out that you're going to show your intelligence and discernment by what you can nitpick about the book. Instead of saying, I thought there's some really awesome points that you have to somehow clarify. Like, well, I don't agree with everything. I've found myself saying things like that. Well, I don't agree with everything. It's like you have to have the disclaimer, because otherwise somebody thinks that by quoting somebody that you do like agree with everything. And so they're going to nitpick. And so, like, I almost feel like I'm making a concession to that. So if I say, oh, I like so-and-so, I don't agree with everything they say, which should be understood, by the way. Is there any human being that you agree 100% on?
That's what you were making me think of, is that should be like a default setting, that there's always going to be disagreement, but that doesn't make that person, like, I don't need to then scapegoat them.
Right. But why do I have to define that?
Yeah, exactly.
And like, why can't I? So I could read a book and agree with 90% of what's said in there and think it's really helpful. And then when I recommend it, do I feel the need to make sure that it's clear what's the 10% that I disagree with? Now, obviously it depends on how big of a deal that 10% is. Like if it's a book about discipleship or whatever, and they're denying the resurrection, like that's a pretty big, like, well, that's the one thing I didn't agree with on that. Like, well, that's a pretty big thing. But being able to discern that, but we find, you do, it's just so many ways we find our identity in being able to separate ourselves and to be able to show that we understand a little bit better than everybody else. And the primary way we do that is to grumble and cause disputing and arguing. So what do you do then? Like, let's say that you're able to get to a place where you say, oh man, that is not representing Christ. It isn't what Jesus did. You think about, I've pointed this out before, that if you just followed Jesus around, you could make the case that he was pro-adultery, that he was anti-Sabbath, that he was pro-Roman government and like pro-high taxes. He just does not take much time to clarify any positions on any of these things. And in fact does things that would make you very much think something different than what he actually views, how he actually views it. And so clearly, whatever it is about these issues, Jesus, his main concern was not ever making sure that everybody knows his points of disagreement with everyone. That was not his main focus. Was on proclaiming the kingdom. And what's fascinating about that then is other people would bring disagreements, but Jesus, other than the temple, other than chasing out the money changers, we don't really see him picking fights or causing disputing. We certainly don't ever see him grumbling and in that kind of way. He basically calls out what people bring against him. He basically just holds up a mirror then, And so if that's the case, if we do get to a place where we say, man, I have been identifying myself by how I'm different than all these people rather than finding common ground and seeking to understand people, well, then what do we do? Like, what would the opposite of grumbling and disputing be? Because he's talking about you're so countercultural that you're going to shine as lights in the midst of a twisted and crooked generation. So twisted and crookedness, he's drawing a parallel there with grumbling and disputing. So that's what a twisted and a perverted generation that doesn't see God as king and sovereign and good and does not see Jesus as the way, they're going to be identified by grumbling and disputing. And he's saying, if you're not a part of that, then you shouldn't be identified in that way. So then what should we be identified in those situations where we would be prone to grumble and disputing? Because like we've talked about, like it's just so natural. I mean, you go to a Little League baseball game. What's the first thing they're going to complain about? The coaches, the rules, the umpires, it's just all around us all the time. It's really rare that you go into any situation and you're not going to hear just a natural bent. I think it's almost like second nature to us. So we don't even realize we're doing it. Like we talked about the air we breathe. So if you do recognize it, and if you realize, that's not who I want to be, well, then what does the opposite of that look like?
Man, what a great question.
Thanks.
It strikes me. I mean, to me, the battle is, at least for me personally, the battle is at the level of, am I aware that I'm living in the presence of the real living God? Like, as you were saying that stuff, Jay, the beginning of the Lord's Prayer was just going through my mind. So if I'm living and I'm at the baseball game and I'm conscious of our Father in heaven, so like that I have a Father in heaven who's with me, and that my aim, like Jesus' aim, is for his kingdom to come and for his will to be done on earth as in heaven. If I'm conscious of that, and not just conscious of it, but I'm actively asking him, which is an exercise of faith that I can't bring that about, but he can. To me, at least for my heart, that really shifts what I'm going to be focused on in the moment. So yeah, there's going to be like for example, the umpires. That's a great example. It happens in soccer with referees, right? They miss something. Oh, there's a handball. Everyone saw it and they missed it. Yeah, they're human, right? But if my heart is just focused on that and how that's unfair, that was one of the categories you gave too, that life isn't fair. So I think that those are moments where we feel like, yeah, that's not fair. That's wrong. You should call that on the other team. That's their problem. If my heart is focused on like that thing rather than God's bigger picture of what's going on, I am going to be more prone to feel that. I am. Mm-hmm. And I think part of this is, what do I do with that when I feel that impulse? Because it's not wrong to be like, yeah, they should have called that. That's not wrong. That's not the same as arguing and complaining. But I mean, for me, I think that my heart needs to go to God with that. Like there are things that I can express to him that end up being transformative for my soul and actually redemptive, that if I express them out loud to people, actually harm people. So yeah. I do think that that's part of it. It's, are we trusting that he's with us and he can see this stuff? And can we express that to him? Whatever the frustration is, whatever the thing that's agitating, what's coming to your mind? I'm curious, like your answer to that. Like, what is the counter to that? Because it's not just pretending like for example, that call at the game, that was a fair call. Don't worry about it. It's like, well, yeah, that is annoying.
Well, some of it, I think is just embracing the reality and not attributing it to like motives, for example. We talk about that a lot, not judging motives. So you can call out like, oh, that was a bad call. But think about how, just using the sports analogy, think about how common it is. We jump from that was a bad call to the umpire is unfair or the referee is against our team.
Where is he from?
Yeah,
that's the question, right?
Where's he from?
Is he from there?
Oh, he's probably from. He's probably from there.
Uh-huh.
And we're assuming that that the reason why he missed that call is he's biased. I love it in basketball because basketball referees are teams of 3, like at the varsity level, and so they rotate. They have a rotation, and you're not even always noticing who the or who the referee is that made the particular call. And I just said, like one of the things that I say, because I'm a math person, like I think in terms of odds, I'm like, if you have some calls that are really clear, and then you have a whole bunch of calls that could go either way. That depends on which team you're a fan of, that's what you think should have happened. And so if that's a coin flip, and now you introduce the other variable of 3 different human beings standing in 3 different spots, I mean, the odds are it's like flipping a coin 50 times. Well, if you flipped a coin 50 times, you're probably not going to get 50 heads and 50 tails. But that doesn't mean that coin is unfairly weighted towards heads. Like it could be 60-40. Like I forget, they've done studies on how disparate, like how big of a disparity you could actually have in there. And I only say that to say, like, we just so quickly connect to all these other things so I think part of it is to just be able to acknowledge the thing that happened and to not attribute motives, to not carry it any farther than that. Like, oh yeah, it was a bad call. That actually happened last night. Lydia was up to bat at softball, and I told her, like, hey, why don't you be aggressive and swing at anything that's close or whatever. A pitch came in. It was really high. And so she didn't swing, and they called a strike. And she looked at me, and I just gave her a shrug of like, yeah, okay. Like, that's okay. Yes, it was high. So now swing at the next pitch. Like, don't. So there can be something about, and that can go even to more serious things where we could talk about like grief. So sometimes we grumble because we don't know how to grieve, and we don't know how to just acknowledge this was broken, this was unfair, or this was sad, or this was egregious, this was wrong. Like, we don't know how to just do that and grieve over that and give that over to God. We feel like, no, like, I think it's sometimes our sense of justice. We're like, but I have to make it right. So some of it is the posture of realizing God will make this right, and I'm trusting in that. Now, if he wants me to participate in that, like maybe as a coach, I'm supposed to, I see, hey, this particular umpire seems to be, people are humans. There is such a thing as an umpire having a personal vendetta against a coach or not liking a coach, and that kind of coloring the way that. And so I'm, maybe you are going to be used to say, you know what, I need to report this to somebody that, hey, this was pretty egregious or whatever. But then what am I going to do with it? Then I'm going to let it go. Or certainly in something that's way more serious, like you see a crime that, your job may be to report that. Your job may be, like, God may be asking you to do something that's in partnership as what he wants to work out in that scenario. So I think so a big part of it is just first that posture of, do I trust that God is sovereign over this? Do I have to have an opinion over this? Is this just something that I can point out and say, well, I think that particular thing was unfair or wrong. And then to be able to let the declaration of that be the resolution of it, because you're turning it over to God. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, it does. It's like you've turned it over, and now I'm going to move on. And I know, personally, when I don't, and it's in that moment, that is a real key moment. Am I going to move on or not? Or am I going to let this fester? Am I going to tell the story again to the next person? Because that can happen too, where we just keep bringing it up. But in trusting it fully and letting it go, I'm glad you said too, I wanted to back up, Jay, you mentioned like sadness, grief. It makes me think of lament as an important just practice that we all need, because every one of us today is going to face something that is lamentable. We really will. If we're connected at all to people, we will feel that, and something will be lamentable. And lament is a healthy way of going to God with that thing and actually getting resolution for it. Going to the one who can actually, usually it's our own heart that needs to be changed, but sometimes there needs to be something outside of us that changes. And it will be, I think, through a process of lament and grieving with God that he gives us wisdom to know what would be the action to take. That could just be a basic principle. Like, if I'm willing to keep talking about this thing, whatever the wrong is, I need to be willing to do something about it. If I'm not willing to do anything, then I probably am in the category that Paul's talking about, of just grumbling and complaining.
That's a really good distinction. Because we've talked about this before, that there are times people, you can just discern, are they just grumbling to grumble? And part of it's because they don't want, you can tell quickly, they don't actually want a resolution to it. Like, so that would come from, say I'm going to grumble something that happens at my work, but I don't want to understand why that policy change was made. I don't even want it to be fixed. Like I literally just want to grumble and complain about it. That is the kind that Paul is talking about, because that demonstrates like a type of pessimism that really isn't fitting a person who believes that Christ has come and the kingdom is here and that I can have abundant life here and that he's working all things together for good. It comes from a need. I don't know. There's a lot of things that it could come from, but yes, you're right that if you feel like I'm not willing to talk about this or reach some kind of an understanding, which again goes back then to the posture. Like that's a divisive posture. A divisive posture is I disagree with that person and I'm not going to talk to them about it. Now, if you're saying that about something small that you literally let go, like I disagree with that umpire about that strike call, but now I've let it go and I'm not, but if I continue to talk about how bad the umpiring is, well, why am I doing that? And then if somebody said, well, you should go talk to the head of umpires and see about like how they train umpires. Oh, I'm not going to do that. And I hear that all the time about all kinds of things in the church, outside of the church, in our country. Like, I'm just going to complain about this, but if I'm given the opportunity to allow my assessment, because at best case scenario, it's you have an assessment that could be helpful, but if you don't have that, then you're just grumbling, and that's what the worldly culture does, because we don't have any power, don't have any hope of anything changing, so you just complain about it.
Yeah, and what a contrast it is from a heart that is thankful, a heart that is content, a heart that is, what you see throughout Philippians is joy.
Right.
Right. Paul must have had in mind, didn't he have a lot to argue about and complain about with his being imprisoned while he's writing this? He clearly wants to be released, but he's not expressing that in a complaining, arguing way.
No.
Right? And he's doing it still full of joy because he's ultimately connected with Jesus. That's the point of reference for him for life. To me, that's the key. And I think we need to be able to help each other. How do we then together, Jay? I think that's one of the things we should talk about is we can think of this, I think, so much in individual terms. And, that's true. We are each individuals with our own ability to complain. But then what about, how does it affect, if I'm doing that, I clearly affect you in some way. So this is more than just like individuals doing this, right? This is important for all of us.
Yeah, think about all the ways in which when we complain and grumble and bicker, how discouraging that is. It's the opposite of building one another up in love and stirring one another to good works. I think when you express, like if I were to come to you and say, hey, Jeff, I experienced this. I went to your class and I experienced this. I'm actually bringing something to you that might be negative, but it's not grumbling and disputing, because I'm going to say, well, hey, can you help me understand why you communicated this in this way? And I'm pretty sure you want people to feel welcome, and this, maybe this made people feel unwelcome or whatever the case is, but I'm able to articulate that, as opposed to going to somebody else in the class and complaining or grumbling about something you said and attributing motives to what you said. That's so discouraging and disheartening. You might actually be saying that to somebody who had a positive experience in that class and did not interpret what you said in a negative way, but now making them second guess and thinking like, oh, should I be concerned about that? Should I be upset about that? And this doing literally the opposite of building one another up in love. And so so that's where I would say then what we are called to do is to build one another up in love. We're called to point one another to Jesus, to be more like Christ. And so I think in any of those circumstances, just asking the question of, well, what actually would shine as a light right now? Sometimes what shines as light is to call out an injustice, because the world might say, well, this isn't a big deal, but we might say, well, no, this is, but it would be in a Christ honoring way. It wouldn't be just grandstanding and just trying to like garner support to, to turn people against someone else. It would be first to go to that person and say, hey, help me understand why you said this, why you did this. And then from there, if there's something that needs to be called out, to be willing to do that. But a lot of times what is shining as light is just not participating in the grumbling and disputing, and instead building up, encouraging, and finding unity. And think about how annoying that is in our culture. So you want to talk about things that are countercultural. If you get into a group of people who are all, say, complaining about, at work, imagine being at work and there's a new policy and everybody's complaining about it. And imagine going into the middle of that and saying, hey, I talked to them about this, and even though I don't know it's what I would do, this was their mindset. Like, their mindset wasn't, how can we make our lives miserable? Their mindset was, well, they had to save money some way or else they were going to have to lay somebody off. And so instead of laying somebody off, they shortened everyone's lunch break, or whatever the case, like, I don't know, whatever the case is. That's one of the problems that we often get into, is because we think we see things from a bigger perspective than we actually do. And we don't really realize that we are dust, that we only can see everything from our very particular point of view. And so there's more going on than just what we see at any given time. And so I think that that's one way that we can help each other, is by giving some of that perspective and say, well, like, I think de-escalating grumbling and disputing by giving the benefit of the doubt, by presenting another side, by, again, it's de-escalating things to try to seek understanding and common ground and finding that. So rather than looking for what you disagree about in something, that you're looking at what do you agree with? What is common ground in that? And that's not being naive, by the way, or just like hiding your head in the sand. I can still be honest about the things I disagree about, but I want to first find the things that I find that we have in common, which is ultimately, Jesus, the only people Jesus doesn't do that with are the Pharisees, which is the most likely group to kind of be tribal. And because they identify themselves by how they are different, how they are better than. And so that's the only group that Jesus really pushes back against in that way proactively.
It strikes me that one of the temptations that we could fall into as well is complaining about complaining. You know what I mean? So like sometimes,
yeah, for sure.
Sometimes the things that can trigger that in us are, like we had the radio on and we were driving someplace and what we heard just frustrated us in some way, or what we watched or whatever. And I guess it just strikes me we need to be alert to that complaining about complaining is complaining. And sometimes a real practical thing we need to do is just not listen to something that is just constantly doing that. Like, I think
Yes.
being aware of what input we have in our lives is really important, because if what we said earlier, that is like a way of actually currently earning a living, is being someone who is kind of a professional complainer, then we need to be aware of that, and we need to not fill our minds constantly with that. So that's getting maybe way too obvious and practical, but I do think it's worth just examining. What am I feeding? What is feeding my heart? Because if we're feeding it with complaint and outrage all the time, that's what's going to come out.
That's huge. Yeah. What are you filling yourself up with? And if you're always listening to people who are complaining about other people, you're going to fall into that. And again, the answer is not to pretend like there aren't things that are wrong in the world. That's not Paul's point here. He's not saying, hey, just pretend like everything's fine. That's not the point. What we're talking about here is this posture of unity, especially in the church. And I think, I think he's talking about both. It's interesting, like, well, is he only talking about don't grumble and dispute among yourselves, because among yourselves, like, you shine as lights? I think that is a big part of it, but I think it's also affects their posture towards the outside world too, because he already says in other places about why I'm not talking about the sexually immoral, like to the church in Corinth. So I'm not talking about the sexually immoral out in the world, because, like, and the greedy and the swindlers and everything, because if I'm talking about that, you wouldn't even be able to live here. He's talking about within the church. And so I think when it comes to grumbling and disputing, that's why we have to be really, really mindful of that in the church, that we aren't prone to that we're not in to your point, if my whole life is built around that, and that's who I listen to, that's what I read, are people who make their living off of grumbling and disputing, well, then that's going to carry over, because again, that's just the air I breathe. It's the language I use.
And it's a habit.
It's a habit.
I mean, like, sometimes it can become just habitual,
right,
where it's just how we express ourselves. And for me, like, my own growth in Jesus, as I've worked through things that are habits, that are sins, it's really apparent that I can't just stop doing the habit. I have to replace it. So I think part of the proactive nature of, like, we just have to assume that each one of us struggles with this, especially if it's a cultural struggle. There's no one of us who's immune. But that means I think we need to be conscious of, what do I need to replace it with? And I think part of what we replace it with is worship and a thankful heart towards God. I think that's what we replace it with. And that's not always going to be expressed externally. Like, I'm not saying that we just are always saying that to each other, but I think at least in our hearts, we're living from a posture of worship and thankful for what God is doing, because we believe he's alive and he is at work in the world. I think that's partly what you replace complaint with.
And if that is our posture, then we're going to be prone to encourage one another and build one another up, and to find points of agreement, and then to say, okay, if this is what we have in common in this, and then that allows us to ask clarifying questions. And by the way, if you have a real disagreement with somebody over something that's key and critical, it'll come out in those conversations as you're trying to find things in common. Like, if you say to somebody, like, well, hey, I think I don't think what you're saying is this, that every umpire in this league are all biased and they're being bought off. And then if the person says, no, I actually think that. Okay, well, now I disagree. I disagree with you. But to just make assumptions, or, there's a lot of different examples I could give with that, but ultimately to realize, man, I think have a posture of living at peace with people. And Paul says, as far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. So have a posture that seeks peace, that seeks to understand first, that when there is a point of disagreement, that you are seeking understanding and making sure that you actually understand what is being said or done or communicated, and that you're doing it from a posture of, I want unity, I want to find like a peaceful agreement here. And then if all else fails, then still be Christ-like in your disagreement. Disputing is not the same thing as disagreement. You can disagree with someone in a Christ-like way, in a loving way, that doesn't devolve into arguing or division. And so I think all of that just pushes against the culture. And when we're able to do that together, it says something different. It says that we have a hope in a God who makes all things right, so we don't have to try to make it all right. It demonstrates that we have a hope in a God who works all things together for good, and so we don't have to worry that something's going to go unnoticed, or that God is like asleep at the wheel somewhere, and so I got to make sure that I point out all these disagreements. It really comes down to, do I trust him, and am I not filled and motivated by fear of what could possibly go wrong, but rather just dealing with the issue as it stands and trying to be faithful in the moment. And that's our hope of how to do that, and how to do that together. It, again, as we say with all these things, there's no way to live this life apart from others. Not only the one another's in Scripture you can't do without one another, but also discernment. It's a communal effort to understand how should we respond as the body of Christ in the midst of a lost and as Paul says, a twisted and crooked generation. Like, how do we function and shine as lights together? We obviously want to help you do that. That's why we do the podcast. That's why we do the ministries that we do. But we know that we need to get you connected with relationships. And so if you are not connected, please let us know. You can email us at connect@faithpastogo.com. You can fill out a communication card, talk to us on a Sunday. But we want to help you in this whole idea of how do we follow Jesus in today's world, because that's our calling. So we hope that this has been helpful to you. We appreciate your time and taking the time to listen. Until next time, grace and peace.